Well, I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you for just a moment about weed management and small grains. And I had the unique opportunity of losing my presentation today. So hopefully I've got most of the information put back. You can see that my picture on this cover frame is alfalfa, not a small grain picture. So I obviously didn't quite get to that. Like we always start out, I think as we think about weed management, it's really important that we correctly identify the species that we're trying to manage. And we need to know how they grow, what favors them, and what we can do when we grow our crops that might keep these from becoming problematic. The other thing is that there's constantly new species coming into the state, and we try in extension to stay on top of those and hopefully kind of provide warnings and also develop management strategies as those weeds become more prevalent within the state. I think everybody knows this, but one of the real critical things is just understanding life cycles. And especially in small grains, you know, the difference between a spring wheat and a winter wheat is often the types of weed species that are competitive with those crops. And so in a situation where we're having a challenge with winter annuals, one option is to switch to maybe a spring crop. And we can break that life cycle just by rotating to a different life cycle of crop, as well as maybe changing up some of the other practices that we're doing. So some of the things I want to just talk about briefly today is first, just a caution with herbicide selection in small grains, some of the things that you ought to be looking at. Then we're going to talk about wild oat control and some of the benefits of controlling wild oats and kind of the cost of the herbicide versus what the yields will pay back. And then we'll just touch on weed control, broadleaf weed control. And in all of this, we're going to try to kind of touch on the fact that in the small grains, we rely a lot on just a handful of herbicide mode of actions. And so in this crop in particular, I'm always concerned that we're rotating modes of action so as not to develop resistance. So here's some things that I think are really important as we consider what herbicides to use in our small grain crop. You need to pick a herbicide that's labeled for your crop, and some herbicides don't include all of the small grains, so you need to be very careful. Sometimes that's based on whether or not that crop is tolerant to the herbicide. You need to pay attention to plant back restrictions. There are some herbicides that are useful in a wheat on wheat type production system, but wouldn't work out very well if you use them if you're in a rotation with alfalfa or other crops. And so pay attention to what those restrictions are and how long you have to wait before you can plant other crops. You need to make sure that the weeds you're trying to manage are on the label. And again, as we rotate herbicides, we need to look for herbicides and herbicide combinations that will control all of the species that we're interested in. You need to pay attention to the growth stages of small grains to avoid crop injury. You should try to rotate herbicide modes of action. And then really, I think it's important that we utilize crop rotation to manage challenging weeds. So really the take home message is read the label, read the label, read the label. And so just to help you a little bit, one of the resources that I find really useful is a site called cdms.net. And on that site, you can search for a product. They have a product database. You type in your product name, and it will bring up all of the products related to the name that you've typed in. In addition, it has an advanced search where you can search for a product name or by the common name of the herbicide. You can search for different pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, or whatnot. You can search by the crop and by the pests, specific pests. And you can also select labels within the state of Utah. And then again, it's just a really great place for you to be able to access those labels and read about the details of how you should use them and what some of the restrictions might be. Okay, so let's talk about wild oat control in small grains. If you attended our virtual field day, I talked about wild oat control, and here was a picture of a study site in a barley crop. And here it is late in the season. And when we think about wild oats, the impacts that they have to our small grain crop includes yield losses, including losses due to dockage, due to the contamination for the seeds that end up with our grain. We have increasing seed bank to other crops. And so if wild oats are challenged to other crops that we're growing, we build up that population. We're spending money on fertilizer and water, which is not going to our crop, but is going to the wild oat. And we even noticed this past year in this particular trial that where the wild oats were the densest, that the crop actually lodged. And so you had this uneven maturity and then an increase in biomass that's not your crop. And so you can see, hopefully, that these heads in my hand, that the one on the left side is from a plot where the wild oats were controlled, and the two on the right side are from an untreated plot. And so you can see the massive impact that the wild oats have had on the barley. And so in that presentation, I kind of talked about, you know, the herbicide costs versus the benefits. And we, you know, here were the prices of the herbicides between $14 to $25 per acre. And if you look at axial alone, or just any wild oat herbicide alone, that cost would be about $14 per acre for that herbicide. And so I calculated out at different prices of barley or small grains, you know, how many bushels would you have to gain in order to pay for the herbicide? And so I just looked today and, you know, let's say $5 per bushel for barley and wheat. And so you'd only have to gain an additional 3 bushels to pay for the herbicide cost for the wild oat herbicide. And then anything above that would be beneficial to you. Well, so here's the trial that we conducted on the barley this year. And you can see the untreated control, wild oats, no control of wild oats in the untreated, as you'd expect. And then these different products, Wolverine Advance, Husky plus Axial, Wolverine plus MCPA, Talinor plus Axial, Axial Star, Wide Match plus Axial, and MCPA plus Axial. And again, there's a bit of variation in the trial, but some of the things that you see is that some products do better than others. One thing to notice is that Wolverine Advanced, when we put MCPA with it, had a significant decrease in wild oat control. And often we see that certain combinations can cause antagonism for herbicides that control grasses. And then Axial Star, for whatever reason, did not do very well. If we look at the yield in bushels per acre, you can see the untreated yielded 23, and all of the treatments at least doubled or almost doubled the yield. And so the gain in yield from these various treatments was anywhere from 18 upwards of 60 bushels per acre. And if we put just a gross value, so take the value of the wheat, and then in the cases of the herbicide minus the wild oat component, you can see that there were huge returns, 3 to 4 times more value from the barley by treating the wild oat than by not. And so I hope that that really helps kind of drive home the point that wild oats are highly competitive, and it does pay to spray for wild oats. I just took some other data from another site from 2019. And again, in this case, we see that all the herbicides provided excellent control of the wild oats. It just was a better year. The yield, though, we can still see that in almost every instance, the use of the herbicides to control the wild oats resulted in significantly higher yields. and then significantly higher returns. I want to point out just a list of some herbicides I looked up from a guide on herbicides that are registered in small grains that have some level of effectiveness against wild oat. And the reason I pull this up is that all of the herbicides listed here have the mode of action that's either a group 1, 2, 3, 8, or 14. And so when we think about controlling wild oats, we don't really have a lot of different modes of action to rotate to. And I think this brings home the point that by rotating crops and again, rotating modes of action, that it's really important. So here, Axial and Discover, same mode of action. Look at these products. All of these are the same mode of action. So we may spray, one herbicide one year and then go to another trade name the next year, but we may be relying on the exact same mode of action. Treflan on its own and Trilate in its own group, and then we have one that's a group 14. So kind of a take-home message from what we've seen is that MCPA appears to antagonize wolverine, but not Axial. So wolverine contains the active ingredient that was in Puma. The broadleaf component of these herbicides made little difference due to the intense pressure of the wild oats. We really didn't see broadleaf weeds. The yield losses are significant and definitely justify spraying for wild oats. And then again, this idea of rotating to a different crop like alfalfa is an easy way to reduce the population of wild oats. There are lots of options for controlling grasses in alfalfa. And then I want to touch then on a little bit of broadleaf weed control. So, in wheat or in small grains, it's generally easier to control broadleaves because of the selectivity that many herbicides can take broadleaves out of grasses. If we don't control the weeds, we still have the issues with weed losses. Often the broadleaves might not be as damaging as a contaminant of our wheat or our small grain, but they definitely can cause yield loss as well as impacting harvest. And I know many of you have seen a field of kochia that had to be burned down in order for the combine to get through the field. Just kind of that point of warning is that most of the herbicides that are labeled for broadleaf control in wheat come from group 2 and group 4 modes of action. So again, even though we have lots of options, they're really heavily based on 2 particular modes of action. So this just shows a trial for broadleaf weed control in wheat in 2019. And really, we didn't see a lot of difference between treatments like Husky or Husky plus MCPA or Talinor. But we did see that when we looked at pigweed control, wide match was significantly less effective against pigweed control. And even though a wide match provided pretty high level of lamb's quarters control, all the other treatments were perfect. And so it was also slightly less effective for control of lamb's quarter. And so again, the point that if you were using Talinor one season, and then you wanted to rotate to wide match the next season, if pigweed was something you were worried about and the pigweed was becoming resistant to Talinor, wide match might not control the population effectively enough to reduce the risk of selecting herbicide resistant plants. So again, you kind of you need to try to match the herbicide with the species that you're trying to control. And then just this was from our broadleaf, dryland broadleaf weed control in wheat this year. And what we saw is that none of the treatments looked really good, except for some reason, the Axial plus the Husky. I think maybe the Axial heated it up a little bit, but it had the best control. And Open Sky plus MCPA, pretty poor, and Talinor, pretty poor. And this is just the population of prickly lettuce coming up in the crop, and then to the lower right-hand side, you can see one of the treatments that was very effective in controlling the prickly lettuce. So some conclusions that I would have here is that herbicide premixtures generally provide higher levels of weed control and may develop the development of herbicide resistance. And again, they generally provide better weed control because by mixing two herbicides together, it often broadens the spectrum of weeds or the number of species that can be controlled. You do need to be careful that mixing some herbicides with MCPA can cause antagonism, and especially with wild oat herbicides or other grass herbicides. And then weed management pays through increased yields and benefits to the following crop. And we should make sure that we don't allow weeds to spread.